Happy Bloomsday, everybody. It's the 200th anniversary of Ulysses. So today I thought I'd talk about my experience reading James Joyce, because he is like, it's five now, but I was my original four pillars of foundation for authors, that being Pynchon, Umberto Eco, Luis Borges, now it's McElroy, and James Joyce. And I gotta say, I love James Joyce so much. He's one of the more emotional authors I read. Not necessarily his prose as well, but my personal life experience at the time. So let me put it this way. There was one thing at the end of college, it was like one of my last classes, an online class. They talked about modernism. And the two people they talked about was James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. And it sounded so mysterious. And it was like a black hole in my knowledge that I just was nagging at me and I wanted to fill, much like Pynchon. So eventually I bought Ulysses because I had another friend as well who was going to do it in a group read. And I tried to read Ulysses and whew, I failed hardcore. And this was after college, and I was going through a rough time because I just didn't know where my place was at in life, and I just wasn't feeling like I was living up to my potential necessarily. So I just really got into reading and just really start to push myself. And one of those authors when I'd go to the library and pick up was James Joyce. So I picked up two of his books to try to understand Ulysses, which was Dubliners and Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. Also, I read it when my puppy was just so small and everything. More was, and I was big into Transformer collecting at the time. I got this Central Prime right when I was reading James Joyce. So every time I look at it, I'm just reminded of James Joyce. I thought that was funny. So the first novel I read was Dubliners, and James Joyce said he tried to find like the beauty of everyday life in that book. Personally, for me, I felt like he found the sadness of everyday life. Reading that book was like therapy, in that it had like all my worst adult fears. Like in Little Cloud, the fear of never becoming what you're supposed to be or your potential is, and getting into a marriage that's kind of loveless. You just kind of settle and it's comfortable. The Dead, just like you burn out in the flame of your youth. Your partner will always have somebody else they loved a lot more than you, and just those are the two ones that stick with me the most. But just the thoughts of like, am I doing things properly? Am I on the right track in life? What if I just settle? What if I just have a meager life like that one guy who was begging for change in the novel? And it was hard to read, not just on like a textual level, which it was. It was a slow read as hell, but just on a very emotional and personal level, because it's like here are all my fears packed into one book, and I'm just reading them, sand sharks. And the next one I read was Portrait of an Artist, a Young Man, which I had a religious upbringing and I went away from that. And there was so many points in that book where I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm just not to sound arrogant. I'm not saying, yeah, I'm sure this reminds me of myself. No, just like, but some of his experience, like I just related to it so hard. Like there was one where he's at a play at his school and he's going to be performing in, and he's waiting before the play starts, and instead of hanging around with his friends or like talking the backstage or getting ready, he's just walking through the school, just like thinking to himself and just reminiscing in his own head. And that kind of hit home to me. I was an odd kid, just kind of alone. I just been myself, so I would just walk around school a lot, just by myself in my own thoughts and everything like that. And just to see his progression from like a religious life and being kind of God fearing and just worrying about sin and the corruption of hell, to just be kind of like an artist atheist who's kind of wide eyed and ready to go to college and everything. And, that is a very youthful thing. And, I'm not religious, but like I can see definitely religion's place in the world and everything like that, even though it does have significant problems. And also, he wrote them kind of at the time around his early 20s, at least Dubliners he did. But those novels just really do reflect the anxiety of youth, the anxiety, and not just like youth as a child, but youth as like a young adult, finally going out your own and just finally trying to make a path for yourself. And like, what is my life gonna be? Am I just gonna be like everybody else and not achieve my dreams? And the answer is yes, you're not gonna achieve your dreams. You're gonna be like everybody else, which isn't so bad. But like these early books really help capture the anxiety of that. The book that actually captures the beauty of the everyday life and just even just common small stuff is actually Ulysses. I feel like it does a great, it's the more mature version. It does a great job of that, where it's like everybody's life is just so interesting in that book. And even though it's so mundane, it's so packed full of meaning. And I'm coupling that with like mythology and stream of consciousness thought and everything. It just gives a gravity to everything. But at the same, I don't like saying it gives a gravity because these are the important stuff in life, the everyday small interactions. Now, I read Ulysses in my golden year of reading. Well, I read like Infinite Jest, Gravity's Rainbow Again, all of Umberto Eco, Don Quixote, and like, so I've attempted Ulysses. This is like my third time attempting Ulysses. Somehow, and I'm not sure how I did it today because I don't have the attention span anymore, especially with model kits in my life now. But I read that book. I read the first 500 pages of that book in 1 week. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that flew over my head. Of course there was, but I don't know how I did that. Then the last 200 pages took me forever to get through. Like I used up all my stamina there. But I'm in my car, having to go into the shop, and they were driving me, and I was reading the passage where they were in that brothel, having like the hallucinations, and just remember reading the crab and the mother's heart representing cancer. Well, I read that later, the meaning of that. But I just love Ulysses. In some ways, I'm a big fan of Horse the Band. So in some ways, it reminds me of that. In that Horse the Band keeps changing song structures, and the song structures are not repetitive. So they won't have repeating parts in a lot of songs, and each album and song feels pretty different from each other. And I got into them in high school, and I think that developed my taste for a lot of things later on in life, because that's what I love about Ulysses. It's each chapter is in a different style, doing different linguistic games, and God, it just makes it so interesting. Like, I've been on a stint of reading books that are really long, but very singular in their scope. And to read stuff like Ulysses, ooh, it's just so good. And I was going to reread it again like a year or two ago, but it just didn't happen. But I read the first few chapters, and the second time around, it's just so much easier. I got so much more out of it. I think also because I'm a better reader, but it's definitely a book you need to read twice. Like, don't worry about going through the first time and understanding everything or even having all the annotations, because most of them you're not going to understand. Most of them are just going to be references to the book. Like, what do you do? Like, read the book, like, oh, I get the reference. And also, you don't even know if you like the book yet. You'll get a lot more out of it the second and third time around. It's a book you can infinitely keep reading. It's one of those books. But damn, like, what a great novel. And kind of like the Prog Cemetery, which is one of my favorite books, it really addressed things at the time during the Trump administration. Well, there was an Irishman saying the English were going to come over and bring parasites and disease to Ireland and everything. I'm like, wait a minute, that's what we're saying now. This is 100 years old? Oh, things don't change. And then also, because I'm Irish as well, and I don't know nothing. I knew nothing about Ireland, but I listened to a big documentary about the history between Ireland and England to really help solidify that for myself and understand a bit more. And so I was kind of getting close to my Irish roots in a sense by learning about Ireland, about reading the greatest Irish novel. And, that's kind of what his intention was, to really capture Dublin so that everybody understands it. So it's one of those novels, even though it's a really beautiful technical novel, it reached outside the boundaries of the novel for me into my everyday life in a sense. And that's what a really good book does, where you read it and then you reflect it onto your own life, or you reflect your own life off the book and like, oh crap, here's all these connections, for better or worse. Also having Jewish ancestry and Leopold Bloom being a Jew and all the racism he experiences, like, yep, goddamn, it's always here. But, on top of that, just all the cool linguistic games he does, and just chapters where I'm like, what the hell is happening? But when you start gleaming stuff like, oh, I get it. I'm not a dum-dum. I'm finally understanding this stuff. And like the Oxen of the Sun chapter was insane. I actually wrote out the first few sentences because they were supposed to be like roughly translated Latin. And I understood the sentences when I finally wrote it out, like, oh, I get it. And I was going to do that for the whole chapter. And I was like, oh, maybe I won't. It's a titan of a book. And if he would have stopped there, amazing. But then he wrote Finnegans Wake. Now, I haven't finished Finnegans Wake. I dabbled in it. I've attempted it like 4 times. And when I was first reading excerpts from it, I got mad. I was like, man, why do you have to write this? Like, you just have to be complicated. He just masturbating and everything. But then it just kind of stuck in my head, that challenging prose. And I've read a Michael Chabon where he kind of analyzes the first page of Finnegans Wake. I was like, oh, okay. So I've read that first page probably like 10 times or something like that. And I was like, okay, I'm getting it now. But like, the more it stuck in my head, and the more I just appreciate, like, you know what, man, this is kind of like a black hole, just a void. Like, it's like, you know what, man, I just want to do this. Damn everybody else, screw it. Let's just have it. And for somebody just to spend 17 years of their life and they have the audacity to even attempt this, and not only attempt but to be successful about it, and just have it there, that's incredible. And whether you like Finnegans Wake or not, just that aspect of alone is so admirable. And this man just committed himself to that. Like, now don't get me wrong, he kind of screwed up his family because they live in abject poverty. Like, there was a story of a doctor coming there, and he saw like Joyce shitting over a chamber pot, just sick to his stomach. Or like one of his daughters had schizophrenia and had to go into a mental asylum. So, you know, when you read about Stephen Debelis and his father being really poor and asking for money all the time, it's kind of what Joyce's father did, and it's what Joyce himself did, unfortunately. But we got this really cool novel out of it. And yeah, it's crazy that it exists. I will finish it one day. It's definitely on my reading list. I was reading some passages out loud to another person before, and like I was like, oh my God, why am I understanding this now? Am I stupid? But yeah, and so he writes this amazing novel, Ulysses, and absolutely surpasses it in difficulty with Finnegans Wake. And he only really has 4 major works to his name. Now, I went on Wikipedia just to check some others. I have Stephen the Hero, and there's some short story collection, there's Exiles and some poems. But like, I'll probably read them eventually in my life, but the main bulk of Joyce, and the stuff that everybody talks about, are his novels. And to think this man only released 4 novels, and in a lot of ways, maybe except for Bottom's Dream, which I haven't cracked into, as an author, he hasn't been surpassed. And to be honest, I'm just so lucky to be a native English speaker to be able to read it, because I couldn't imagine these things translated. And mind you, even as a native English speaker, it doesn't suffice, because especially Finnegans Wake, there's a lot of other languages you should know about. And you can go and get a doctorate degree of just getting all the annotations and understanding every reference in Ulysses and Finnegans Wake. But then at that point, it's like, oh my God, I did all this for one book. So that's why, also another way, it's like, hey, if you don't get everything, that's fine. I think only Joyce would get into everything, or some huge Joyce-obsessed scholar, which I don't know exist. And if they do, they're not on the internet because they're too busy studying Joyce. But Joyce is just such an incredible author, and though he gets touted as the technical mastermind, which he absolutely is, he is able to capture the human element in such a beautiful way. And like Pynchon said in Short Learner, you have to start with the human element for novels. And when I think back to Ulysses, I think of a lot of like scenes of Stephen Debelis walking by the shore, or Leopold Bloom just wandering through the city, which I think a lot of us have done in our lonelier moments, so just trying to understand what we're going through life. When I think of Portrait of an Artist as a young man, I just can't help but picture myself walking around my middle school in that one scene, or like, the Catholic school that I went to as a child. Even though I'm removed from Dublin, Ireland by 100 years, and, in America on the West Coast, even though there is a Dublin, California in Northern Cal, which is funny, I just can't help seeing my childhood in a lot of ways in that stuff. And with Dubliners, which honestly might be my favorite Joyce work, it was for a while, but like the fact that he wrote The Dead in his early 20s is astounding. That is like one of the saddest novels I've ever read. And just the story was just, a Christmas dinner party, a couple's there, they were enjoying themselves. Funny thing, Joyce says they talk about people playing piano and they're doing all these crazy arpeggios and scales. It's like, oh, I don't like that. It's too complicated. It just muddles things up. It's like, what? You're the last one to talk about that, man. Get out of here. But, just this nice Irish Christmas party, and they're walking home, and this guy's ready to pork his wife. He's feeling on her. And not from like a horny standpoint also. I mean, horny, yeah, but like, he's really feeling it from an emotional level. And then they get home, and his wife just starts crying, and she misses her first lover who died at 17, who went through the snow to talk to him to see like how he's doing. And because he went through the snow, he died. And she's crying, and he just kind of, he knows he's the second fiddle, and he's kind of there like, and the snow falls over everything, including the dead, realizing that he's not going to be able to ever take this man's place, and he's never going to leave her. And that's so sad. But like, when you get more into adulthood, when you talk more to people, you have these fun times with people, and you have these nice experiences, or you just talk to people casually on the street. But like, when you actually hear their story, there's so many sad stories out there. And Joyce is just able to capture that pretty much perfectly. Perfectly is such a dumb word to use, but I think most people would agree with me on that. So with James Joyce, you have a lot of happiness because Finnegans Wake and Ulysses is supposed to be a comedy, but you also get a lot of sadness out of it. And the technical elements don't muddle that at all, and sometimes enhance it. So, I love James Joyce as an author. I, I'm really happy I read him in my life, and I want to get back into reading him again and reading more of him. Because every time you go through it, there's just so much substantial you can say on his prose. Yeah, it's kind of like when you hear non-readers talk about great authors, like Hemingway or stuff like that. I'm sure Hemingway's a great author, but when there's all this hidden underlying meaning and everything, but it's always kind of like, hey, you're going a little too far in it. James Joyce is kind of that way. Not in the cryptic sense, yeah, with all the references, but also like all these underlying meanings and experiences and all this tension, sadness, and happiness that is just under the surface. And it's there because that's what we experience in human life as well. So thank you for letting me ramble a bit about James Joyce. Happy Bloomsday, you all, and I'll talk to you later. I was kind of an odd kid when I was growing up, just really in my, what the fuck? This goddamn bug in here.